Okay guys, this is our lecture on ecological succession for wildlife biology. Okay, so ecological succession is a process by which communities in a particular area change over time. So an example of a ecosystem that may change over time is a forest that gets logged, or a volcanic island that is continually adding new land. Or even an ecosystem that is an old growth forest and a tree falls down in the forest and creates a new ecosystem. So we're going to talk about each different kind of ecosystem. Okay, and each early community is modified by the environment that causes it to change and to occur. So these early communities are what's going to shape the later communities. So if it's a scrubland, and the environment doesn't allow very many trees to grow, then maybe your climax community isn't going to be a hardwood forest, maybe it'll just end up being rangeland. Or if you're in an old growth forest in North Carolina, maybe the climax community is going to be large hardwood and pine trees. So what I want you to do for just a second is pause, and I want you to think about how ecological succession, the change of a community over time, is going to affect the biological community. So I'll give you just a second. So hopefully you paused and talked to a partner or thought about it yourself about how a biological community is affected by ecological succession. And hopefully you said something like, as the ecology or the succession changes over time, then different ecosystems will form because of the different organisms that are adapted to that ecosystem. So we want to look at this community here on the screen. It is it goes from annual plants to hardwood tree. Hardwood tree is going to be our climax community, and we're going to start with annual plants. So as each new successive community comes along, it's going to be favorable for different species. If you look here to the left of your screen, you see annual plants. That's going to be more favorable for organisms like butterflies, hummingbirds, bees, mice, birds of prey that like to eat mice and they can see them better, maybe badgers, anything that's kind of adapted to low plants, herbaceous plants that don't grow very tall. As we move to the right, we see that the trees get bigger. And so let's look at our climax community, which is the hardwood tree community here all the way to the right. That community is going to be more favorable for things like owls, deer, other things that like to live in hardwood forests, woodpeckers, for example. So you can see how this community has changed over time. It's become less favorable, more favorable for other organisms. So we're seeing how the ecosystem is changing over time due to this successional process. Okay, it just changes until you get a climax community, which in this case is hardwood trees. So here we see how the composition of the community changes with time and those factors that affect it. So we talked about things like limiting factors in our last class and how they can affect and impact population size. But we're going to look at how this may impact succession. So if we look at the past community, we can see that some species may have been outcompeted or didn't tolerate the conditions of that ecology or that ecological system the way that other organisms did. So it's basically survival of the fittest in this example. If we look at the present community, we have abiotic factors like...
Howdy. Good morning, Grantsville High School. All seniors must take the citizen test to graduate.
Okay, I'm sorry for that interruption. So I think what I was talking about before I had to pause the video was how abiotic factors affect the present community. So if we look at the list, this list of abiotic factors, you can see that there are no organic or any type of living factors. But all of these factors are going to be important in the survival of biotic organisms. So if you look at this list, light intensity, wind speed, air temperature, soil composition, all of those are going to be really important in determining what organisms are going to be able to survive in the future community. So if we look at the future community, we can almost figure out what is going to be established based on the present community and how we can, and if we look at other ecological timelines that have happened, we can kind of predict what's going to happen in our future community. So there are two types of succession that we're going to talk about, main ones. We have a couple of sub ones that we'll talk about, but the two main ones are primary succession and secondary succession. So let's talk about primary first. So primary succession happens when there is nothing there to begin with. So that's really important to remember. Okay, things like bare rock, receding glaciers, volcanic regions, because we know in volcanic regions that new land is being formed, like the volcanic islands of Hawaii. So it's really important to know and understand that with primary succession, you're not starting out with anything, okay? You're going to have bare rock, and then you have your colonizers or your pioneer species that are lichens, bryophytes, and annual herbs. So lichens are like, it's a moss, like mosses. Bryophytes are actually mosses. Lichens are a fungus and a plant that kind of make a symbiotic relationship, which we'll talk about later. But these pioneer species have to colonize because there's nothing there to start with. Okay, so you go bare rock, you've got lichens, then bryophytes and annual herbs, grasses and small shrubs, then fast-growing trees, and then you get to a climax community. This happens between 100 to 200 years, so it takes quite a while for this to happen. So our pioneer species that I mentioned in the last slide are things like lichens, bryophytes, annual herbs, these things that can be transported by animals or wind or water, so they are easily transported, basically, okay? And everybody in Utah should know about pioneers and what pioneers do. They're the first people to arrive or first things to arrive. We even have a day called Pioneer Day. So pioneer species are your first colonizing organisms. So our secondary succession is when you have something to begin with and then it gets taken out, like destroyed, or I guess destroyed really isn't the best word for it, but it gets changed. So an example, you have a land clearance of some type, fire, landslide, a forest clearing for agriculture or housing or other human purposes. But this happens more quickly than primary because you already have something to start with. It's really important to remember that when the trees were there before, they dropped seeds, and those seeds are still in the soil. So those seeds can use the soil that's present and regrow. So you don't have this waiting period that you do with primary succession because you're not waiting for those pioneer species to arrive because you've already got a seed bank in the soil. So gap succession is one of those subtypes that I mentioned before, and this is basically that age-old question of forest. But when a tree falls in the forest, it takes out trees around it, and so light can get to the forest floor, and that's how meadows are created, or small areas in forest communities where you have grassy areas. So there's reduced light on the soil, the tree falls, takes out a bunch of trees with it, and then the sunlight's going to fill that forest floor, and it's going to create a little micro community within that forested area. So that's how you get some biodiversity in a forest area. Okay, wetlands are super important. We haven't really talked about wetlands yet, but they are extremely important in pretty much every ecology of any wildlife that you can think of. They provide food, they provide an area for aquatic species to lay their eggs and raise their young, provide water for organisms, so there's a lot of benefits to wetland. But what happens is you have this succession that happens, especially with what we call vernal ponds, and that's when you have seasonal ponds. So in the spring, they fill up with water when it rains, and then they dry up when the rain is gone. And the benefit to that is that you have organisms like frogs who need to lay their eggs and breed, but fish really like frog eggs. But if they lay their eggs in vernal ponds, there's no fish because the water dries up during certain times of the year. So it is really important to understand that vernal ponds are essential to a lot of aquatic organisms. However, we may have what's called this eutrophication process, okay? So when you have runoff into these little vernal ponds or into these wetlands, it increases the sedimentation, which increases the turbidity of the water or the cloudiness of the water. Okay, and this can reduce the amount of sunlight that goes into the water, but it can also lead to more production because it's bringing nutrients with it. So it has this huge algal bloom and lots of photosynthesis, but it can reduce the amount of oxygen that's in the water and increase fish kills or even frog egg kills because those frog eggs they still need those nutrients. Okay, this can be caused by natural causes or anthropogenic, which means human causes, and it can be a type of pollution. So this kind of shows you, if you look up in the top picture here, you have what's called an oligotrophic lake, which means it's clear, it's beautiful, it doesn't have anything going on in it, which is actually just as bad as if you have a eutrophication pond, which is the one that's kind of in the middle, it kind of looks like pea soup. Because the oligotrophic doesn't have any nutrients in it. In contrast to the eutrophication, which has so many nutrients in it, such an algal bloom that it reduces the oxygen in the water for aquatic organisms and actually can reduce the biodiversity. Okay, so this picture is showing you what would happen in a secondary succession model. So you have a hardwood, mature climax forest that a fire comes through, but you can see that the seed bank is buried underneath this ash and soil, and those seeds are completely fine. So even though we have a bunch of killed trees up here in the top in number 2, what happens is that some of those trees survive, they resprout, and then you've got the seed bank that produces more trees, and then you have your recovered forest, which can happen more rapidly than a primary successional forest.